Hello everyone, I am Mr. Midnight. I know many of you enjoy listening to these videos as you fall asleep. So before you drift off, I'd love for you to leave a comment letting me know where in the world you're tuning in from. And if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and subscribe. Alright, now let's get comfortable, relax, and dive into tonight's case. Story 1. In the late summer of 2016, in the quiet town of Perambivore, life moved at a pace defined by routine and familiarity. It was a place where neighbors knew each other, where daily rhythms were predictable, and where the idea of violent crime felt distant from everyday life. But on April 28, 2016, that sense of normalcy was shattered by a crime so brutal that it would send shockwaves across India, igniting outrage, grief, and a demand for justice that would dominate headlines for months. What began as concern over a young woman not responding to calls would soon unfold into one of the most disturbing criminal cases in recent Indian history. At the center of this tragedy was Jisha, a 30-year-old law student whose life had been defined by resilience and struggle. Raised in difficult circumstances, she had worked tirelessly to build a future for herself, pursuing education as a way out of hardship. Her home, a modest structure in a semi-isolated area, reflected the simplicity of her life. She lived with her mother, who was hearing and speech impaired, and together they navigated the challenges of daily life with quiet determination. Jisha was known in her community as someone who kept to herself, focused on her studies and responsibilities, not someone who attracted attention or conflict. On the evening of April 28th, concern began to grow when Jisha failed to answer repeated calls. Her mother, unable to communicate easily, sensed that something was wrong. Neighbors were alerted, and when they approached the house, what they discovered would haunt them for years to come. Jisha was found inside, the victim of a violent and deeply disturbing attack. The details of the crime were so severe that they shocked even seasoned investigators. This was not just a murder. It was an act of extreme brutality that raised immediate questions about the nature of the perpetrator and the circumstances that had allowed such a crime to occur. News of the incident spread rapidly, first through local communities and then across the state. The reaction was immediate and intense. People demanded answers. Who could have committed such a crime, and how had it gone unnoticed in a residential area? The location of the house, somewhat isolated and lacking proper security, became a focal point in early discussions. It was clear that the perpetrator had taken advantage of vulnerability, but beyond that, there were few immediate clues. The investigation was taken up by the Kerala police, who began the process of securing the scene, collecting evidence, and reconstructing the timeline of events. From the outset, the case presented significant challenges. There were no direct eyewitnesses, no immediate suspects, and no clear indication of forced entry that could easily identify how the attacker had gained access. The brutality of the crime suggested a level of intent and aggression that investigators knew would require careful analysis to understand. As forensic teams worked through the scene, they gathered whatever evidence they could: biological samples, signs of struggle, and any trace that might point toward the individual responsible. The process was meticulous, but time was a critical factor. In cases like this, the first few days are often the most important, and investigators were under immense pressure to produce results quickly. Meanwhile, public outrage continued to grow. Protests were organized, with people demanding swift action and justice for Jisha. The case struck a deep emotional chord, not only because of the nature of the crime, but because of who Jisha was: a young woman striving to improve her life, living in vulnerable conditions, and ultimately becoming the victim of an act that seemed both senseless and preventable. The narrative quickly expanded beyond the crime itself, touching on broader issues of safety, inequality, and the protection of women in society. Media coverage intensified, bringing national attention to what had happened in Perambivore. With that attention came scrutiny of the investigation, of the circumstances surrounding the crime, and of the systems that were meant to protect individuals like Jisha. Questions were raised about infrastructure, about the lack of security in certain areas, and about whether more could have been done to prevent such an incident. In the early stages, investigators worked with limited information, but they began to develop a profile of the suspect. The nature of the crime suggested that the perpetrator was likely someone who had either observed the victim or was familiar with the area. The isolated location of the house, combined with the absence of immediate witnesses, pointed towards someone who understood the environment well enough to act without being noticed. As days passed, the pressure on the investigation increased. The case had become a national priority, and the demand for results was relentless. Every lead was pursued, every piece of evidence examined, but the identity of the attacker remained unknown. For the family of Jisha, this uncertainty was unbearable. The need for answers, for closure, grew more urgent with each passing day. And yet, despite the challenges, investigators continued their work, driven by the knowledge that somewhere there was a person responsible for what had happened. Someone who had committed an act of unimaginable violence and then disappeared back into the world. The question was not whether they would find him, but how long it would take. In the days that followed the discovery of Jisha's body in Perambivor, the investigation entered a phase defined by urgency, pressure, and an overwhelming demand for answers. The brutality of the crime had already shaken the conscience of India, and with each passing hour, the expectation that law enforcement would identify and apprehend the perpetrator grew stronger. For the Kerala police, this was not just another case. It was one that had become a matter of public trust, national attention, and the pursuit of justice under intense scrutiny. From the outset, investigators faced a difficult challenge. The crime scene, while providing evidence of a violent struggle, did not immediately point to a clear suspect. There were no eyewitnesses who could describe the attacker, and the isolated nature of Jisha's home meant that the crime could have occurred without drawing attention. However, the forensic evidence collected from the scene became the foundation of the investigation. Biological samples, including DNA evidence, were carefully preserved and sent for analysis. In cases where direct identification is not possible, such evidence can become the most critical link between a crime and the individual responsible. At the same time, investigators began conducting extensive ground-level inquiries. They spoke with neighbors, local residents, and anyone who might have noticed unusual activity in the area around the time of the crime. Every detail, no matter how small, was documented. The goal was to reconstruct Jisha's last known movements and identify any individuals who might have had access to or knowledge of her home. This process, though time-consuming, was essential in narrowing down potential leads. One of the key directions the investigation took was toward individuals who were not permanent residents of the area but had been seen nearby. Perambivor had a population that included migrant workers, many of whom lived in temporary accommodations and moved frequently for employment. While this did not imply guilt, it expanded the pool of individuals that investigators needed to consider. Tracking movements, verifying identities, and locating individuals who might have left the area after the incident became a major focus. As forensic analysis progressed, a significant breakthrough began to take shape. The DNA evidence collected from the scene provided a profile that could be compared against potential suspects. This was a critical development, as it allowed investigators to move beyond speculation and towards scientific confirmation. The challenge, however, was identifying a matching individual. Without a database of known offenders that included the perpetrator, the process required investigators to systematically collect and compare samples from individuals who fell within the scope of their inquiry. During this period, the investigation expanded beyond Perambivor. Teams were deployed to track leads across different regions, following any indication that might point toward a suspect. The scale of the operation reflected the seriousness of the case, and the determination to ensure that no possibility was overlooked. It was during this phase that attention began to focus on a man named Amarul Islam. Amarul Islam was a migrant worker from the state of Assam, and his presence in the area had come to the attention of investigators through local inquiries. Reports indicated that he had been working in the region and had been seen in the vicinity around the time of the crime. What raised further suspicion was his sudden disappearance after the incident. While not conclusive on its own, this behavior aligned with patterns often observed in individuals attempting to avoid detection. Acting on this lead, the Kerala police initiated a coordinated effort to locate him. This involved collaboration with law enforcement agencies in other states, as well as the use of intelligence networks to track his movements. The search extended across significant distances, reflecting the reality that suspects can move quickly and attempt to blend into new environments. Eventually, the pursuit led investigators to Assam, where Amarul Islam was located and taken into custody. His arrest marked a turning point in the case. For the first time since the crime had occurred, there was a concrete suspect whose identity could be directly examined in relation to the evidence collected from the scene. Following his arrest, investigators proceeded with the next critical step, matching his DNA with the samples obtained during the forensic analysis. The results confirmed a match, establishing a direct link between Amarul Islam and the crime. This development provided the strongest piece of evidence in the case, transforming the investigation from a search into a prosecution. The confirmation of the DNA match was a moment of both relief and gravity. Relief, because the investigation had identified the individual responsible. Gravity, because it underscored the reality of what had occurred and the need to ensure that justice would be carried through to its conclusion. For the family of Jisha, this development brought a sense of progress, but it did not diminish the loss they had suffered. The legal process that followed would determine the outcome, but the emotional impact of the crime remained unchanged. As news of the arrest spread, public reaction was immediate. There was a sense that the case had reached a crucial milestone, but also a recognition that the journey was far from over. The focus now shifted to the legal proceedings, where the evidence would be presented, examined, and challenged. The strength of the forensic findings would play a central role, but the case would also need to address every aspect of the investigation to ensure that the outcome was both just and legally sound. At the same time, the case continued to influence broader conversations. It highlighted the importance of forensic science in modern investigations, demonstrating how DNA evidence can provide clarity even in the absence of eyewitness accounts. It also raised questions about safety, particularly for individuals living in vulnerable conditions, and the need for systems that can better protect them. As the investigation transitioned into the next phase, one thing was clear. The identification of Amarul Islam had brought the case closer to resolution, but the path to justice would now depend on the legal process that lay ahead. With the arrest of Amarul Islam and the confirmation of forensic evidence linking him to the crime, the case moved into its most conclusive phase, the courtroom. What had begun as a brutal and deeply disturbing incident in Perambur now became a legal battle where every detail would be examined, challenged, and weighed against the standard of proof required to deliver justice. For the prosecution, the task was clear: to present a coherent, evidence-backed narrative that established beyond doubt that Amarul Islam was responsible for the murder of Jisha. For the defense, the objective was equally critical: to question the evidence, test its reliability, and ensure that no conclusion was accepted without scrutiny. The trial was conducted in a special court designated for such serious offenses, reflecting both the gravity of the crime and the public attention surrounding it. From the outset, the proceedings drew significant interest, not only from the local community but from across India. The case had already become symbolic of larger issues: justice for victims of violent crime, the role of forensic science, and the effectiveness of investigative processes. and the trial was seen as the stage where those issues would be addressed in a definitive manner. One of the most critical components of the prosecution's case was the forensic evidence. The DNA samples collected from the crime scene, which had been matched to Amarul Islam, formed the backbone of the argument. In court, experts were called to explain the process by which the samples had been collected, preserved, and analyzed. They detailed the scientific methods used to establish the match, emphasizing the reliability and accuracy of the findings. This was not merely a presentation of results. It was an effort to demonstrate that the evidence met the highest standards of credibility and could withstand cross-examination. The prosecution also worked to establish a timeline of events. By reconstructing the sequence of actions leading up to and following the crime, they aimed to show that the accused had both the opportunity and the presence in the area at the relevant time. Witness testimonies, though limited in direct observation of the crime itself, were used to support this reconstruction. Individuals who had seen Amarul Islam in the vicinity, or who could confirm aspects of his movements, contributed pieces to the overall narrative. In addition to forensic and circumstantial evidence, the prosecution highlighted behavioral aspects that they argued were consistent with guilt. The fact that the accused had left the area shortly after the crime, traveling back toward Assam, was presented as indicative of an attempt to avoid detection. While such actions do not prove guilt on their own, when combined with other evidence, they formed part of a broader pattern that the prosecution sought to establish. The defense, however, challenged these conclusions at every stage. They questioned the handling of evidence, raising concerns about whether proper procedures had been followed during collection and analysis. They examined the chain of custody, seeking to identify any gaps or inconsistencies that could undermine the reliability of the forensic findings. In cases where DNA evidence plays a central role, even small procedural errors can become significant points of contention, and the defense sought to explore every possible angle. They also scrutinized the timeline presented by the prosecution, arguing that circumstantial evidence must be interpreted with caution. The absence of direct eyewitness testimony meant that much of the case relied on inference, and the defense emphasized the importance of ensuring that such inferences were not treated as definitive proof. Their arguments were not merely about disproving the prosecution's case, but about reinforcing the principle that guilt must be established beyond reasonable doubt. Throughout the trial, the court was tasked with balancing these competing narratives. It had to evaluate the strength of the forensic evidence, the credibility of witnesses, and the overall coherence of the case presented by both sides. This process required careful consideration, as the stakes were extraordinarily high, not only for the accused, but for the victim's family and the broader sense of justice. For the family of Jisha, the trial was a continuation of an emotional journey that had begun with unimaginable loss. Each day in court brought them face to face with the details of what had happened, details that were both painful and necessary in the pursuit of justice. Their presence served as a constant reminder of the human impact of the case, grounding the legal proceedings in the reality of the life that had been lost. As the trial progressed, it became increasingly clear that the forensic evidence would play a conclusive role in the final outcome. The clarity and consistency of the DNA match, combined with the supporting circumstances, provided a foundation that the prosecution argued was both strong and conclusive. The defense continued to challenge, but the weight of the evidence remained a central factor in the court's deliberations. The broader public followed the proceedings closely, with each development reported and analyzed. The case had already left a lasting impact on discussions about crime and justice, and the trial was seen as a critical moment in determining how that impact would be resolved. It was not just about the outcome, but about the process, whether it would demonstrate fairness, thoroughness, and adherence to the principles of law. As the trial moved toward its conclusion, the question that had driven the investigation from the beginning came into sharper focus. Had the evidence presented truly established the identity of the perpetrator? And if so, what would justice look like in this case? As the trial reached its final stage, the long and emotionally charged journey that began in April 2016 in Perambivor moved toward a decisive conclusion. The courtroom, which had witnessed months of arguments, examinations, and careful scrutiny of evidence, now stood at the point where all of it would be weighed and translated into a judgment. For the family of Jisha, this moment carried a significance that went far beyond legal procedure. It represented the possibility of accountability, the hope that the system would recognize the gravity of what had been done, and the need for a sense of closure after enduring years of grief and uncertainty. The court's deliberation was grounded in the evidence that had been presented, with particular emphasis on the forensic findings that formed the backbone of the prosecution's case. The DNA evidence, which had directly linked Amarul Islam to the crime scene, remained the most compelling element. Unlike circumstantial interpretations, this evidence provided a scientific connection that was difficult to refute. The court also considered the broader context, the timeline established during the investigation, the presence of the accused in the area, and his movements following the incident. Each of these factors contributed to a cumulative understanding of the case. When the verdict was finally delivered in 2017, the court found Amarul Islam guilty of the crimes committed against Jisha. The judgment reflected the seriousness of the offense, acknowledging not only the act itself but the level of brutality involved. The decision was received with a mix of relief and solemnity. Relief, because the process had led to a clear outcome. Solemnity, because no verdict could undo what had been lost. Following the conviction, the court proceeded to sentencing. In cases of such gravity, the law allows for the most severe penalties, and the decision regarding punishment required careful consideration. After evaluating the nature of the crime and the circumstances surrounding it, the court sentenced Amarul Islam to death. The ruling was based on the principle that the case fell within the category of the rarest of rare, a legal standard used in India to determine when capital punishment is appropriate. The sentencing marked a significant moment in the case, but it was not the end of the legal process. Under Indian law, death penalty cases are subject to automatic review by higher courts, ensuring that the decision undergoes additional layers of scrutiny. This process is designed to prevent errors and uphold the highest standards of justice, particularly in cases involving irreversible punishment. As a result, the case continued to move through the appellate system, extending the timeline but reinforcing the importance of due process. For the family of Jisha, the verdict and sentencing brought a measure of validation. The system had recognized the crime and identified the individual responsible, but even with that recognition, the emotional impact of the loss remained unchanged. Justice, in this sense, was not about restoration. It was about acknowledgement and accountability. It was about ensuring that the person who had committed the act would face the consequences defined by law. Beyond the courtroom, the case left a lasting imprint on society. It sparked widespread discussions about safety, particularly for women living in vulnerable conditions. The circumstances of the crime, an isolated home, limited security, and the absence of immediate support, highlighted gaps that needed to be addressed. In the months and years that followed, there were calls for improved infrastructure, better lighting in residential areas, and stronger community vigilance. The tragedy had exposed risks that could no longer be ignored. The case also underscored the critical role of forensic science in modern criminal investigations. The use of DNA evidence had been instrumental in identifying and prosecuting the victim, demonstrating how scientific methods can provide clarity even in the absence of eyewitness accounts. This aspect of the case became a reference point for discussions about strengthening forensic capabilities across the country, ensuring that similar tools could be applied effectively in future investigations. At a broader level, the story of Jisha became a symbol of both vulnerability and resilience. Her life, marked by struggle and determination, stood in stark contrast to the violence that ended it. In the aftermath of the case, her name came to represent not only the tragedy itself, but the collective demand for justice and change. Public memory of the case continued to shape conversations about rights, protection, and the responsibilities of society. The investigation and trial also offered important lessons for law enforcement. The challenges faced in the early stages, lack of immediate leads, absence of eyewitnesses, and the need to rely heavily on forensic evidence, highlighted the importance of preparedness, training, and coordination. The eventual resolution of the case demonstrated that even in the most difficult circumstances, persistence and methodical work can lead to results. As time passed, the immediate intensity of the case began to fade from headlines, but its impact did not disappear. It remained part of the broader narrative of how societies confront violence, how justice systems respond to extreme crimes, and how communities seek to rebuild a sense of safety after being shaken. In the end, the story that began in a quiet part of Perambivore became one that resonated far beyond its origins. It was a story of a life lost, of a crime that demanded attention, and of a process that sought to deliver justice through careful examination and adherence to the law. And while no outcome could ever replace what was taken, the case stands as a reminder that the pursuit of truth, however long and difficult, remains essential. Story 2. In the early hours of April 18, 2016, while most of the small city of Midlothian was still asleep, a quiet routine was about to be interrupted in a way that would leave an entire community searching for answers that, even years later, would remain elusive. The setting was the Creekside Church of Christ, a place typically associated with faith, community, and safety. But on that morning, before sunrise, its empty halls would become the scene of a crime that would puzzle investigators and captivate the public across the United States. Terry "Missy" Bevers was a 45-year-old fitness instructor, known in her community for her energy, discipline, and commitment to helping others. She led early morning boot camp classes, often held outdoors or inside available spaces like the church. For her, this routine was more than just a job, it was a way of life. She inspired those around her, encouraging people to push beyond their limits and improve their health. On that particular morning, she had planned to host a class at the church due to inclement weather. It was a decision that seemed ordinary at the time, a simple adjustment to ensure that the class could continue despite the rain. Missy arrived at the church in the early morning hours, sometime before 5:00 a.m., preparing for the class that would begin shortly. Participants were expected to arrive soon, and as always, she would be ready, equipment set up, space arranged, and her characteristic energy already in motion. But unknown to her, someone else had already been inside the building. Surveillance cameras within the church captured footage that would later become one of the most chilling pieces of evidence in modern true crime. Hours before Missy's arrival, an individual dressed in what appeared to be tactical gear, helmet, vest, gloves, was seen moving through the hallways. The person carried what looked like a tool, possibly a hammer or similar object, and wandered from room to room in a slow, deliberate manner. The behavior was unusual. It did not resemble a typical burglary, nor did it show urgency. Instead, it suggested patience, familiarity, and a level of comfort within the environment. The figure moved through doors, opening and closing them, occasionally striking glass panels as if testing or attempting entry. The movements were methodical but not hurried. There was no clear indication of what the person was searching for, or whether they were searching at all. The footage, grainy yet detailed enough to capture posture and gait, would later become central to the investigation. At approximately 5:00 a.m., Missy Bevers entered the church. What happened next unfolded out of view of the cameras, but the outcome was devastating. When participants began arriving for the class shortly after, they were met with a scene that immediately signaled something was terribly wrong. Missy was found inside the building, unresponsive, the victim of a violent attack. Emergency services were called, but it quickly became clear that she could not be saved. The location, the timing, and the nature of the crime created an immediate sense of shock. This was not a random outdoor incident or a late-night altercation. It had occurred inside a church in the early hours of the morning, targeting someone who was simply preparing for her daily routine. As law enforcement arrived and secured the scene, the investigation began to take shape. The Midlothian Police Department took the lead, quickly recognizing the significance of the surveillance footage. The individual captured on camera became the primary focus. Their appearance, covered head to toe in gear, made identification difficult. Their face was completely obscured, leaving investigators to rely on other characteristics, such as height, build, and the distinctive way they moved. The footage raised immediate questions. Was this a burglary that turned into something more, or was Missy the intended target from the beginning? The behavior of the individual suggested planning, but the lack of clear theft or obvious motive complicated the narrative. Nothing appeared to be taken from the church, and the actions of the person inside did not align with a typical break-in. As news of the crime spread, the reaction was swift and intense. The idea that someone had entered a place of worship, waited inside, and carried out a violent act against a well-known member of the community was deeply unsettling. Residents of Midlothian found themselves confronting a reality that felt both close and incomprehensible. The surveillance footage was released to the public, and it quickly gained widespread attention. The figure in tactical gear, walking through the halls with an almost casual demeanor, became one of the most recognizable images associated with unsolved cases in the United States. People analyzed every detail: the clothing, the movements, the timing, searching for anything that might reveal the identity of the person behind the mask. Investigators began collecting evidence from the scene, working to establish a timeline and identify any potential connections. They examined Missy's personal and professional life, looking for indications of conflict, threats, or anything that might suggest a motive. At the same time, they pursued leads related to the possibility of a burglary, considering whether the suspect's presence had been opportunistic. But as the investigation unfolded, one thing became increasingly clear. This was not a simple case. The individual had taken steps to conceal their identity, had entered the building before the victim arrived, and had remained inside long enough to encounter her. These factors pointed toward a level of planning that could not be easily explained. And as the days turned into weeks, the question that haunted investigators and the community alike remained unanswered. Who was the person in the church that morning, and why were they there? As investigators from the Midlothian Police Department continued examining the crime scene inside the Creekside Church of Christ, it quickly became clear that the case would not follow a straightforward path. There were no immediate eyewitnesses, no clear suspect, and no obvious motive. The attack had occurred in a controlled indoor environment where the only direct visual record came from the church's surveillance cameras. That footage, which had already begun circulating among investigators and eventually the public, became both the most valuable piece of evidence and one of the most frustrating. The video showed the same unknown figure dressed in what appeared to be tactical or law enforcement-style gear, walking through the church long before the arrival of Missy Bevers. The person moved slowly through hallways, opened doors without urgency, and occasionally struck glass panels with a tool. The actions did not resemble someone in a hurry to steal valuables. Instead, they suggested someone who was waiting, someone who knew that at some point, someone else would enter the building. That single detail began to shape the direction of the investigation. If the person had been inside for a significant amount of time before Missy arrived, then the possibility that she had been specifically targeted became harder to ignore. Investigators began reconstructing a timeline minute by minute. Missy had arrived at the church early, as she often did, preparing for her fitness class before participants showed up. The suspect had already been inside for a considerable period, captured repeatedly on camera wandering through the halls. The attack itself occurred outside the visible range of the cameras, which meant that the only way to understand what happened during those final moments was through forensic analysis and circumstantial evidence. Forensic teams worked carefully through the building, examining doorways, glass panels, floors, and any object the suspect might have touched. Every fragment of material, dust, fibers, fingerprints, and shoe impressions was collected and analyzed. One of the most significant aspects of the footage was the suspect's distinctive gait. The way the individual walked appeared slightly unusual, and investigators hoped that someone might recognize that movement pattern. Even when faces are hidden, body language can sometimes provide clues that lead to identification. As news of the crime spread beyond Midlothian, the case began receiving national attention across the United States. The image of a person in full tactical gear inside a church in the early hours of the morning was both unsettling and unforgettable. Media outlets replayed the footage repeatedly, and members of the public began analyzing it in extraordinary detail. People slowed down the video, zoomed in on specific frames, and debated everything from the suspect's height to the possibility that the clothing might not have been genuine tactical equipment at all, but something designed purely to disguise identity. While public attention helped keep the case visible, it also created additional challenges. Investigators received a large number of tips, many of them sincere but difficult to verify. Each tip had to be evaluated carefully, because overlooking even a small detail could mean missing a crucial lead. At the same time, they needed to separate speculation from actionable information. In high-profile cases, the volume of public input can sometimes slow progress rather than accelerate it. Another key part of the investigation focused on the personal life of Missy Bevers. Detectives examined her relationships, her work, her social media presence, and any potential conflicts that might have provided a motive. This was not done out of suspicion toward the victim, but because understanding the circumstances surrounding her life could reveal whether the crime was random or targeted. Friends, family members, and colleagues were interviewed in depth. The goal was to determine whether anyone had reason to harm her or whether she had received threats in the past. At the same time, investigators explored the possibility that the suspect had intended to commit a burglary and had encountered Missy unexpectedly. However, this theory raised more questions than answers. The suspect's actions on camera did not resemble someone searching for valuables, and there was no clear evidence that anything significant had been stolen. The time spent wandering through the building suggested patience rather than opportunism, which made the theory of a random break-in less convincing. As weeks turned into months, the case remained unresolved. The surveillance footage, which had once seemed like a breakthrough, now became a constant reminder of how close investigators were to the truth and how far away it still felt. The identity of the person in the video remained unknown, and without that identity, every other part of the case remained incomplete. For the family and friends of Missy, the uncertainty was especially painful. The loss itself had been devastating, but the absence of answers made it even harder to move forward. Every new update brought hope, and every delay brought frustration. The community of Midlothian continued to follow the case closely, unwilling to accept that something so violent could remain unresolved. The investigation did not stop, but it entered a slower, more methodical phase. Detectives continued to analyze the footage, re-examine the evidence, and follow up on leads that might once have seemed insignificant. Sometimes, the smallest overlooked detail can become the key to solving a case. The question was whether such a detail existed, and whether it could still be found. As the months stretched into years following the killing of Missy Bevers, the investigation led by the Midlothian Police Department entered a phase that was both exhaustive and frustrating. The initial surge of momentum, driven by the shocking nature of the crime and the eerie surveillance footage from the Creekside Church of Christ, gradually gave way to a slower, more painstaking process. Yet despite the passage of time, the case refused to fade from public attention. Instead, it evolved into one of the most discussed unsolved mysteries in the United States, fueled by speculation, analysis, and a persistent sense that the answer was somehow just out of reach. One of the most compelling and debated elements of the case remained the behavior of the suspect captured on video. The individual's movements, deliberate, unhurried, and seemingly unconcerned about being recorded, continued to puzzle investigators. This was not the behavior typically associated with someone acting on impulse. Instead, it suggested a level of planning or confidence that raised critical questions. Did the suspect know the layout of the building? Were they familiar with the schedule of Missy Bevers and her early morning routine? Or was this someone who had simply chosen the location and time based on opportunity? Over time, several theories began to take shape, both within investigative circles and among the public. One of the most prominent was the possibility that Missy had been specifically targeted. This theory was supported by the fact that the suspect had entered the building well before her arrival and appeared to be waiting inside. The absence of theft or clear signs of burglary further reinforced the idea that the crime might not have been financially motivated. Instead, it pointed toward a more personal or intentional act. To explore this possibility, investigators conducted a thorough examination of Missy's personal and professional life. They reviewed her communications, including messages, emails, and social media interactions, looking for any indication of conflict, threats, or unusual behavior. They spoke with family members, friends, and colleagues, attempting to identify anyone who might have had a reason to harm her. While this line of inquiry was essential, it did not produce a clear suspect. There were no obvious enemies, no known disputes that escalated to violence, and no direct evidence linking any individual to the crime. At the same time, attention turned toward the suspect's physical characteristics, particularly the distinctive gait captured on video. Analysts studied the footage repeatedly, focusing on the way the individual walked, the positioning of their feet, and the overall rhythm of their movement. Some observers noted what appeared to be a slight irregularity, leading to speculation that the suspect might have had an injury or a natural variation in their stride. Law enforcement hoped that this detail might prompt recognition. Perhaps someone who knew the suspect would identify them based on this unique characteristic. The clothing worn by the suspect also became a major point of discussion. The tactical style gear, including a helmet and vest, appeared designed to conceal identity rather than serve a functional purpose. Investigators considered the possibility that the gear was not authentic law enforcement equipment, but rather a disguise intended to mislead or intimidate. This raised another critical question. Was the suspect attempting to create a false impression, perhaps to divert suspicion, or to exploit the authority associated with such attire? As the investigation continued, law enforcement expanded their efforts beyond Midlothian, seeking assistance from state and federal agencies. The hope was that additional resources and expertise might uncover leads that had been missed or provide new perspectives on the evidence. Despite these efforts, the case remained unresolved, and the identity of the suspect remained unknown. Public interest in the case did not diminish. If anything, it grew stronger over time, fueled by online communities dedicated to analyzing unsolved crimes. The surveillance footage became a subject of intense scrutiny, with individuals examining every frame for hidden clues. Discussions ranged from detailed breakdowns of the suspect's movements to broader theories about motive and identity. While some of these efforts generated useful insights, others ventured into speculation that could not be substantiated. For the family of Missy Bevers, the ongoing uncertainty was a constant burden. The lack of answers meant that the case remained open, both legally and emotionally. Each new theory brought a mix of hope and frustration, hope that it might lead to a breakthrough, and frustration when it did not. The passage of time did not lessen the impact of the loss. It only deepened the desire for resolution. Investigators, meanwhile, continued their work behind the scenes. They revisited evidence, re-interviewed witnesses, and followed up on leads that might once have seemed insignificant. Advances in technology, particularly in forensic analysis, offered the possibility that new methods could yield results where earlier ones had not. In many unsolved cases, breakthroughs come not from a single dramatic discovery, but from the accumulation of small details that eventually align. Yet, despite all these efforts, the central mystery remained intact. The person captured on camera inside the church, walking through the halls in the early hours of April 18, 2016, had not been identified. The motive behind the crime remained unclear, and the connection, if any, between the suspect and the victim had not been established. By this stage, the case had taken on a broader significance. It was no longer just about what had happened inside the Creekside Church of Christ, but about the challenges of solving crimes in an age where evidence can be both abundant and ambiguous. It highlighted the limits of surveillance, the complexities of human behavior, and the difficulty of turning information into certainty. And as the investigation continued, one question persisted above all others. Who was the person behind the mask, and would they ever be found? As the years passed after April 18, 2016, the case surrounding the killing of Missy Bevers remained one of the most haunting unsolved mysteries in the United States. What had begun inside the quiet halls of the Creekside Church of Christ in Midlothian had not reached the kind of resolution that many had expected in the early days of the investigation. Instead, it became a case defined by persistence without closure, evidence without identification, and a question that refused to fade despite the passage of time. The Midlothian Police Department never officially closed the case. Investigators continued to treat it as active, periodically revisiting evidence, re-examining leads, and encouraging the public to come forward with any information, no matter how small. Over time, advancements in forensic technology offered renewed hope that something previously overlooked might emerge as significant. In many cold cases, breakthroughs occur years later, sometimes triggered by a single detail that had once seemed insignificant. That possibility kept the investigation alive, even as the trail grew older. The surveillance footage remained the centerpiece of the case. The image of the unidentified individual, dressed in tactical-style gear and moving through the church with an unsettling calm, continued to circulate widely. It became one of the most recognizable visuals in modern true crime, discussed in documentaries, analyzed in online forums, and revisited in media coverage. Despite this exposure, the identity of the person in the footage remained unknown. The disguise had done exactly what it was intended to do: conceal. Over time, investigators explored and publicly addressed various theories, though none were confirmed. The idea of a targeted attack continued to hold weight, largely because of the suspect's presence inside the building before Missy's arrival. Yet without a clear motive or identifiable connection, this theory remained incomplete. The alternative, that the crime had been opportunistic, was difficult to reconcile with the suspect's behavior on camera. The lack of forced urgency, the absence of theft, and the apparent waiting period suggested something more deliberate. Another aspect that continued to draw attention was the suspect's gait. Analysts and members of the public alike remained fascinated by the distinctive way the individual walked. Some believed it could indicate a physical condition or injury, while others suggested it might have been altered intentionally to mislead observers. Law enforcement revisited this detail multiple times, hoping that someone might recognize it and come forward. But recognition, if it existed, had not yet translated into identification. For the family of Missy Bevers, the absence of answers meant living with an ongoing sense of uncertainty. Grief in such cases is not confined to a single moment. It becomes something that evolves over time, shaped by the lack of resolution. The knowledge that the person responsible had not been identified added a layer of difficulty that extended beyond loss. It meant that the story remained unfinished. The community of Midlothian also carried the weight of that uncertainty. A place once defined by routine and familiarity had been forced to confront a reality in which such a crime could occur without explanation. Over time, life continued as it always does, but the memory of what had happened did not disappear. It became part of the community's collective awareness, a reminder of both vulnerability and resilience. The case also had a broader impact on how similar investigations were perceived. It highlighted the limitations of surveillance technology, showing that even when a suspect is captured on camera, identification is not guaranteed. It underscored the importance of forensic evidence, but also the reality that not all cases yield usable results. And it demonstrated the challenges of determining motive, particularly when the available evidence does not clearly point in one direction. Despite the lack of resolution, the investigation into the death of Missy Bevers continued to serve as an example of persistence. Law enforcement agencies often revisit such cases with fresh perspectives, new tools, and renewed determination. The possibility of a breakthrough, however distant, remains. In some cases, it is a new witness, a technological advancement, or a reevaluation of existing evidence that finally provides the missing piece. As of today, the identity of the individual captured inside the Creekside Church of Christ in the early hours of April 18, 2016, remains unknown. The motive behind the crime has not been definitively established, and no arrests have been made. The case stands as a reminder that not all questions are answered quickly or at all. And yet, the story endures, not only as a record of what happened, but as an ongoing search for truth. It is a story that continues to be told, analyzed, and remembered, not because it has been resolved, but because it has not. In the end, the case of Missy Bevers is not defined solely by the absence of answers, but by the determination to keep asking the question that matters most. Who was behind the mask, and will that answer ever come? Story 3. In the early morning hours of July 10, 2016, in a quiet residential neighborhood of Washington, D.C., a crime occurred that would quickly grow beyond the boundaries of a single tragic incident and become one of the most widely discussed and debated cases in modern American history. The streets were calm, the city largely asleep, and the summer air carried the stillness of a typical weekend night. But within that stillness, something went terribly wrong, something that would leave a young man dead and a nation searching for answers. Seth Rich was 27 years old, a data analyst working for the Democratic National Committee. He had moved to Washington, D.C., with the ambition of contributing to public service, believing in the power of civic engagement and political systems to shape society. Friends and colleagues described him as energetic, committed, and deeply involved in his work. Outside of his professional life, he was known for his sense of humor, his love for his family, and his desire to make a difference. On the night of July 9th, Seth had spent time out in the city, visiting a bar and later heading home. It was a routine evening, one that gave no indication of what was to come. Sometime after 4:00 a.m. on July 10th, as he walked through the Bloomingdale neighborhood on his way back to his residence, he was shot. The exact sequence of events remains unclear, but the outcome was immediate and devastating. Seth was found on the street, conscious but gravely injured. Emergency services responded quickly, and he was transported to a nearby hospital. Despite efforts to save him, he succumbed to his injuries. The cause of death was gunshot wounds, and the case was initially treated as a homicide likely connected to a robbery attempt. Yet even in those early moments, there were details that would later complicate that assumption. The investigation was led by the Metropolitan Police Department of the District of Columbia, who began gathering evidence and reconstructing the timeline of Seth's final hours. They examined the location where he was found, looking for shell casings, signs of struggle, and any indication of how the confrontation had unfolded. Witnesses were sought, though the early morning timing and relatively quiet nature of the neighborhood meant that direct observations were limited. One detail quickly stood out: Seth's belongings had not been taken. His wallet, phone, and other personal items were still with him. In cases of robbery, theft is typically a primary motive, and the absence of stolen items raised questions. Was this truly a robbery gone wrong, or was there another explanation? At the same time, investigators reviewed surveillance footage from nearby areas, hoping to capture any movement that could be linked to the incident. The goal was to identify potential suspects, vehicles, or patterns that might provide clues. But like many cases that occur in low visibility conditions, the available footage did not immediately reveal a clear answer. As news of the crime spread, it initially followed the trajectory of many urban homicides: tragic, serious, but not yet widely known beyond local coverage. However, the circumstances surrounding Seth Rich's professional role and the timing of his death would soon draw national attention. The year 2016 was already marked by intense political activity in the United States, and any event connected, even indirectly, to political institutions carried heightened scrutiny. Within days, the case began to attract broader interest. Questions about motive, about the nature of the attack, and about the absence of theft led to increasing speculation. The investigation, however, remained grounded in evidence. Law enforcement continued to pursue leads consistent with the initial theory of a robbery, while also remaining open to other possibilities. For Seth's family, the focus was not on speculation, but on loss. The sudden and violent nature of his death left them grappling with grief and confusion. They sought answers, not only to understand what had happened, but to ensure that the person responsible would be held accountable. Their calls for justice were clear and direct, centered on the need for a thorough and accurate investigation. As the days turned into weeks, the case did not resolve. Instead, it began to expand in ways that few could have anticipated. Public attention grew, fueled by questions that had yet to be answered. The absence of a clear suspect, combined with the unusual details of the crime, created an environment where uncertainty could thrive. And within that uncertainty, the story of Seth Rich began to take on a life beyond the original investigation. The question that remained at the center of everything was simple, yet unanswered. What really happened on that quiet street in Washington, D.C., in the early hours of July 10, 2016? As the investigation into the death of Seth Rich continued, detectives from the Metropolitan Police Department of the District of Columbia worked to build a clearer picture of what had happened in the early hours of July 10, 2016 in Washington, D.C. in the immediate aftermath. The case had been treated as a likely attempted robbery, a type of crime that, while tragic, was not uncommon in certain parts of the city. However, as investigators examined the details more closely, aspects of the incident began to challenge that initial assumption. One of the most significant elements was the condition in which Seth was found. His personal belongings, his wallet, phone, and watch, remained untouched. In a typical robbery scenario, the primary objective is theft, and the absence of stolen items raised questions about whether the motive aligned with that classification. Investigators did not dismiss the robbery theory outright, as there are instances where such crimes are interrupted or do not proceed as intended, but it was clear that this case required a broader examination. Detectives focused on reconstructing Seth's movements on the night of July 9th into the early morning of July 10th. They traced his path from the bar he had visited to the neighborhood where he was attacked. Surveillance footage from nearby businesses and residential cameras was collected and reviewed frame by frame. The goal was to identify any individuals who might have followed him, any vehicles that appeared repeatedly, or any unusual activity in the area during that time frame. While some footage provided general context, none offered a definitive view of the attack itself. At the same time, investigators sought out potential witnesses. Given the early hour, the number of people who might have seen or heard something was limited. However, even small observations, unfamiliar sounds, passing vehicles, or brief glimpses of movement can become important pieces of a larger puzzle. Each statement was documented and cross-referenced with the timeline being developed by the police. As the official investigation progressed, the case began to attract increasing public attention across the United States. The year 2016 was marked by heightened political tension, and Seth's role at the Democratic National Committee placed him within a broader context that extended beyond the immediate circumstances of his death. This context contributed to the emergence of various theories, some of which suggested motives that differed significantly from the robbery scenario being pursued by law enforcement. It is important to understand that these theories developed largely outside the official investigative process. While they gained visibility in media and online discussions, the Metropolitan Police Department of the District of Columbia maintained that the evidence available to them continued to support the likelihood of a robbery attempt. At the same time, they emphasized that the case remained open and that all credible leads were being examined. The presence of multiple narratives created a complex environment. On one hand, public interest can generate useful tips and keep attention focused on a case. On the other hand, it can introduce speculation that is not supported by evidence, making it more difficult to separate fact from assumption. Investigators had to navigate this landscape carefully, ensuring that their work remained grounded in verifiable information. For the family of Seth Rich, this complexity added another layer to an already painful situation. They were not only dealing with the loss of a loved one, but also with the widespread discussion of theories that often extended beyond the facts established by the investigation. Their focus remained on finding the truth and ensuring that the person responsible would be identified and held accountable. In the months following the incident, law enforcement continued to pursue leads. Tips were received from members of the public, some of which led to further inquiries. Investigators analyzed phone records, revisited surveillance footage, and re-examined physical evidence from the scene. The process was methodical, reflecting the need to build a case that could stand up to legal scrutiny if a suspect were identified. Despite these efforts, no arrest was made. The absence of a clear suspect meant that the case remained unresolved, and as time passed, it began to take on the characteristics of other difficult investigations, those where the available evidence provides direction but not definitive answers. The lack of resolution did not indicate a lack of effort, but rather the inherent challenges involved in cases where key information is missing or incomplete. The broader attention surrounding the case continued to grow, with ongoing discussions about possible motives and interpretations of the evidence. However, within the official investigation, the focus remained consistent: to follow the evidence, to verify each lead, and to avoid conclusions that could not be supported. As the first year after Seth's death approached, the case stood at a critical point. The initial momentum had slowed, but the investigation was far from over. Detectives remained committed to finding answers, knowing that even a single new piece of information could change the direction of the case. And so the central question persisted, unchanged by time and complexity. If this was not a typical robbery, then what had really happened, and who was responsible? As time moved beyond the first year following the death of Seth Rich, the investigation entered a phase that is often the most difficult in any criminal case, the period where immediate leads have been exhausted, but the need for answers remains just as urgent. For detectives with the Metropolitan Police Department of the District of Columbia, the challenge was no longer just about gathering evidence, but about reevaluating everything they had already collected, searching for connections that might not have been obvious in the early days of the case. The core facts had not changed. Seth had been shot in the early morning hours of July 10, 2016 in Washington, D.C. His belongings had not been taken. no suspect had been identified. These elements continued to define the investigation, shaping both the official approach and the public perception of the case. What had changed, however, was the level of complexity surrounding it. Over time, the case became increasingly intertwined with broader public narratives. Discussions about motive expanded beyond the initial robbery theory, with various interpretations emerging in media and online spaces. Some of these interpretations were based on circumstantial details, while others extended far beyond the evidence available to investigators. This environment created a situation in which the case was not only a criminal investigation, but also a subject of ongoing public debate. For law enforcement, maintaining focus under these conditions required discipline. The Metropolitan Police Department of the District of Columbia continued to emphasize that their conclusions would be based solely on evidence that could be verified. They revisited the crime scene analysis, reviewed ballistic reports, and continued to examine surveillance footage from surrounding areas. Advances in technology offered the possibility that older evidence could yield new insights, particularly in areas such as video enhancement and data analysis. One of the persistent challenges was the lack of direct witnesses. Without someone who had seen the attack or could identify a suspect, the case relied heavily on physical evidence and indirect information. This made it more difficult to establish a clear sequence of events or to narrow down potential suspects. Even small gaps in the timeline could have significant implications, and filling those gaps proved to be a complex task. Investigators also continued to follow up on tips from the public. Some leads pointed to individuals who had been in the area at the time, while others suggested possible motives or connections. Each lead required careful evaluation, as acting on incomplete or inaccurate information could divert resources and delay progress. In cases like this, the volume of information can be both a resource and an obstacle, depending on how it is managed. For the family of Seth Rich, the passage of time did not lessen the need for answers. If anything, it intensified it. The absence of resolution meant that the case remained open in every sense, legally, emotionally, and publicly. They continued to advocate for progress in the investigation, urging anyone with information to come forward, and emphasizing the importance of focusing on verified facts. The broader community in Washington, D.C. also remained aware of the case, though the initial intensity of attention had begun to shift. Like many unsolved cases, it moved in and out of public focus, resurfacing with new developments or renewed discussions. Yet for those directly affected, it never truly faded into the background. As investigators revisited evidence, they looked for patterns that might not have been apparent before. This included analyzing the location of the incident in relation to other reported crimes, examining whether similar methods had been used elsewhere, and considering whether the case could be connected to a broader pattern of activity. While such connections are not always present, exploring them is a standard part of investigative work. Despite these efforts, the central challenge remained unchanged. Without a clear suspect or definitive motive, the case could not move forward in the way that would lead to an arrest and prosecution. It existed in a state that is familiar in criminal investigations, but difficult to accept, a state where the truth is believed to be within reach, but not yet fully uncovered. At the same time, the case highlighted broader issues about how investigations are conducted and understood. It demonstrated the importance of evidence-based conclusions, particularly in situations where public attention introduces additional complexity. It also underscored the role of time in investigations, how it can both hinder and help, closing off certain avenues while opening others. By this stage, the story of Seth Rich had become more than a single case. It had become a reflection of the challenges inherent in seeking justice when answers are not immediately available. It showed that even in a city with extensive resources and experience, some cases resist resolution, requiring patience, persistence, and continued effort. And so, As the investigation continued, the question that had been present from the very beginning remained unresolved. What truly happened in those early morning hours, and what piece of the puzzle was still missing? As the years passed following the death of Seth Rich, the case remained unresolved, existing in that difficult space between known facts and unanswered questions. What began in the early hours of July 10th, 2016, on a quiet street in Washington, D.C. had not led to an arrest, a trial, or a definitive explanation. Instead, it became a case defined by persistence, complexity, and the enduring need for clarity. The Metropolitan Police Department of the District of Columbia continued to treat the investigation as open. Detectives revisited evidence periodically, applying new techniques and reevaluating earlier findings in the hope that something previously overlooked might provide a breakthrough. In many cases, time can work both for and against an investigation. Memories fade, but technology improves. Leads grow cold, but new perspectives emerge. The challenge lies in bridging that gap, in finding the connection that turns uncertainty into resolution. One of the central elements that remained consistent throughout the investigation was the working theory that the incident was a robbery attempt. While questions had been raised about the absence of stolen belongings, law enforcement maintained that not all robbery attempts result in theft, and that the circumstances of the case were consistent with crimes that had occurred in the area. At the same time, they acknowledged that the lack of a suspect meant that the case could not be conclusively resolved under that theory. Public attention surrounding the case did not disappear, but it evolved. In the months immediately following Seth's death, discussions had been intense and widespread. Over time, they became more fragmented, resurfacing periodically as new information or interpretations emerged. This pattern is common in high-profile cases, where initial attention gives way to intermittent focus driven by developments or renewed interest. For the family of Seth Rich, the passage of time brought neither answers nor closure. Their efforts remained centered on seeking justice through official channels, emphasizing the importance of evidence-based investigation and responsible reporting. They advocated for a focus on verified facts, recognizing that speculation, while often well-intentioned, can complicate the search for truth. The broader impact of the case extended beyond the immediate investigation. It highlighted the challenges faced by law enforcement in solving crimes where direct evidence is limited and witnesses are scarce. It also underscored the role of public perception in shaping how cases are understood, particularly in an environment where information can spread quickly and take on different forms. At a deeper level, the case became a reminder of the importance of process. Justice is not defined solely by outcomes, but by the methods used to pursue them. Investigations must be thorough, evidence must be carefully evaluated, and conclusions must be supported by facts. In situations where answers are not immediately available, the commitment to these principles becomes even more critical. As of now, no one has been charged in connection with the death of Seth Rich. The case remains open, its central question still unanswered. What happened on that street in the early morning hours of July 10th, 2016? Was it a robbery that did not unfold as intended, or was there another explanation that has yet to be uncovered? And most importantly, who was responsible? For the community in Washington, D.C., the case serves as a reminder that even in well-populated, well-monitored environments, some crimes defy easy resolution. It reflects the reality that justice can be a long and uncertain process, one that requires patience as well as determination. And for those who continue to follow the case, the story remains unfinished. It is not defined by a conclusion, but by the absence of one, a narrative that continues to exist in the hope that, someday, the missing piece will be found. In the end, the case of Seth Rich stands as both a tragedy and a question. A tragedy because of the life that was lost, and a question because the answer to what truly happened has yet to be fully revealed. And until that answer is found, the story does not end. Story 4. In the early hours of May 17, 2016, in one of the busiest and most modern districts of Seoul, a crime took place that would send shockwaves across the nation and ignite a debate far beyond the immediate tragedy. Gangnam Station, a place known for its constant movement, bright lights, and dense crowds, was not somewhere people associated with vulnerability. It was a symbol of urban life, fast, connected, and seemingly secure. Yet within the confines of a public restroom near one of its exits, a young woman's life was taken in an act that would challenge perceptions of safety and spark a nationwide reckoning. The victim was a 23-year-old woman whose identity was not widely disclosed out of respect for her family. She was an ordinary citizen, someone who had gone about her evening without any indication that it would end in violence. There was no known connection between her and the man who would be accused of her murder. No prior interaction, no shared history, no obvious reason why she would become a target. That absence of connection would later become one of the most disturbing aspects of the case. According to the investigation, the accused, a 34-year-old man identified as Kim, had entered the restroom area hours before the crime. What made this detail particularly chilling was the length of time he remained there. Reports indicated that he waited for an extended period, allowing multiple men to enter and leave the restroom without incident. It was only when a woman entered that he acted. The attack was sudden and brutal. There were no witnesses inside the restroom at the moment it occurred, and the confined space meant that the victim had little opportunity to escape. By the time the situation was discovered, it was already too late. Emergency services were called, but the victim could not be saved. The location, the timing, and the nature of the attack immediately drew intense attention. Police quickly apprehended the suspect near the scene. His arrest brought some initial relief, as the individual responsible had been identified and taken into custody. However, it also marked the beginning of a deeper and more complex conversation. During questioning, the suspect made statements that would shape the public understanding of the case. He claimed that he had been ignored and mistreated by women throughout his life, and that his actions were driven by resentment. These statements became a focal point of the investigation and the public response. They raised questions about motive, whether the crime was driven by personal grievance, mental health issues, or broader societal factors. The lack of a direct relationship between the victim and the perpetrator made the act appear random, yet the suspect's own words suggested that it was not entirely without intent. As news of the crime spread across South Korea, the reaction was immediate and intense. What had occurred at Gangnam Station was not seen as an isolated incident, but as something that touched on larger issues of safety, gender, and social dynamics. Public spaces, particularly those that are crowded and highly trafficked, are often assumed to be safer due to visibility and activity. This case challenged that assumption in a profound way. The response extended beyond expressions of grief. Vigils were held near Gangnam Station, where people left flowers, notes, and messages in memory of the victim. These messages often went beyond mourning, reflecting anger, fear, and a demand for change. The site became a place not only of remembrance, but of collective reflection. At the same time, law enforcement and officials worked to piece together the details of the case. Surveillance footage from the area was reviewed to confirm the suspect's movements and establish a timeline. The fact that he had waited for hours before committing the act became one of the most significant and unsettling findings. It suggested a level of deliberation that complicated the understanding of the crime. Mental health evaluations of the suspect were also initiated, as part of the standard legal process in cases involving serious offenses. His statements, combined with his behavior, raised questions about his psychological state at the time of the crime. Determining this would be critical in the legal proceedings that followed, as it would influence how responsibility and intent were assessed. As the investigation progressed, it became clear that this case would not be confined to the courtroom. It had already begun to influence public discourse, raising difficult questions about how society understands violence, how it addresses underlying issues, and how it ensures safety in spaces that are meant to be shared by everyone. And at the center of it all remained a single, deeply unsettling reality. A young woman had entered a public restroom in one of the busiest areas of Seoul and never came out. As the investigation into the Gangnam Station murder case moved forward, authorities in Seoul began to build a more detailed understanding of both the suspect and the sequence of events that had unfolded inside the restroom near Gangnam Station. What had initially appeared as a shocking but contained act of violence quickly revealed deeper layers that would complicate the case legally, socially, and emotionally across South Korea. The suspect, identified as Kim, became the central focus of intense scrutiny. Investigators examined his background, his personal history, and any prior interactions with law enforcement or mental health institutions. It emerged that he had previously received psychiatric treatment, and this detail became one of the most critical aspects of the case. His mental state at the time of the crime would not only influence the legal proceedings, but also shape the national conversation that followed. According to police findings, Kim had entered the restroom area hours before the attack and remained there, allowing multiple individuals to pass through without incident. This behavior was consistent with what surveillance footage suggested, a prolonged period of waiting that indicated selection rather than spontaneity. The fact that he did not act until a woman entered reinforced the perception that the crime was not random in the traditional sense, but targeted in a broader, more generalized way. During interrogation, Kim reportedly stated that he felt ignored and disrespected by women throughout his life. These statements were documented and would later be presented as part of the case, but they also raised immediate questions about interpretation. Were these expressions of motive, or were they reflections of a disturbed mental state? The distinction would become a central issue, dividing public opinion and influencing how the case was understood. Law enforcement agencies in Seoul worked to ensure that the investigation remained grounded in evidence. They reconstructed the timeline using surveillance footage, witness statements, and forensic analysis. The physical evidence from the scene confirmed the nature of the attack, while the footage helped establish the suspect's movements before and after the incident. Together, these elements formed a coherent sequence of events, even as questions about motive remained open to interpretation. At the same time, the case began to generate a powerful public response. The area near Gangnam Station transformed into a space of collective mourning. Thousands of people visited the site, leaving behind handwritten notes, flowers, and messages. Many of these messages expressed not only grief for the victim, but also fear and frustration about safety in public spaces. The scale of the response reflected how deeply the incident had resonated. The public discourse quickly expanded beyond the specifics of the crime. Some viewed the attack as an example of gender-based violence, pointing to the suspect's statements and the deliberate nature of his actions. Others emphasized the role of mental illness, arguing that the suspect's psychological condition was the primary factor. These differing perspectives did not exist in isolation. They often overlapped, clashed, and evolved as more information became available. For investigators and legal authorities, however, the focus remained on establishing responsibility within the framework of the law. Psychiatric evaluations were conducted to determine the suspect's mental competency and his ability to understand and control his actions at the time of the crime. These evaluations would play a crucial role in determining how the case would proceed in court. The victim's family, meanwhile, faced the unimaginable reality of their loss. While much of the public attention centered on broader societal issues, for them the case was deeply personal. Their focus was on justice, on ensuring that the individual responsible would be held accountable in a manner that reflected the severity of the crime. As weeks passed, the investigation reached a stage where the facts of the incident were largely established, but the interpretation of those facts remained contested. The suspect had been identified and apprehended. The sequence of events had been reconstructed. Yet the question of why this happened, why the victim was chosen, and what it meant, continued to generate debate. The case had already moved beyond being just a criminal investigation. It had become a focal point for discussions about safety, mental health, and societal responsibility in South Korea. The challenge now was to navigate these discussions while ensuring that the legal process remained fair, thorough, and grounded in evidence. And as the case moved toward the courtroom, another critical phase was about to begin. Not just the search for what happened, but the determination of how justice would be defined. As the Gangnam Station murder case moved from investigation into formal prosecution, the focus shifted toward the courtroom in Seoul, where the question was no longer what had happened, but how it would be judged under the law. The facts established by investigators were clear. The suspect, Kim, had waited inside the restroom near Gangnam Station for an extended period, allowed multiple men to leave unharmed, and then attacked a woman who entered alone. The sequence of events suggested deliberation, but the interpretation of that deliberation became the central issue of the trial. From the outset, the defense and prosecution approached the case from fundamentally different angles. The prosecution emphasized the calculated nature of the suspect's actions. They pointed to the hours of waiting, the selective targeting, and the absence of any immediate provocation as indicators that the act had been intentional and controlled. In their view, the suspect's behavior demonstrated awareness and purpose, elements that are critical in establishing criminal responsibility. The defense, however, focused on the suspect's mental health history. Medical records and expert testimony were introduced to show that Kim had previously received psychiatric treatment and exhibited symptoms consistent with serious mental illness. They argued that his statements about feeling ignored and mistreated were not simply expressions of motive, but reflections of a distorted perception of reality. According to this argument, his actions could not be fully understood without considering the extent to which his mental condition affected his judgment and behavior. Psychiatric experts played a significant role in the proceedings. They were asked to evaluate whether the suspect had the capacity to understand the nature of his actions and whether he could control them at the time of the crime. These evaluations are often complex, involving not only clinical assessments but also interpretations of behavior before, during, and after the incident. In this case, the suspect's prolonged waiting period and his ability to avoid detection were cited by the prosecution as evidence of control, while the defense framed them as actions influenced by delusion and impaired reasoning. The court had to navigate these competing interpretations carefully. Legal standards require a distinction between mental illness and legal insanity, and not all psychological conditions meet the threshold required to significantly reduce responsibility. The challenge lay in determining where the suspect's condition fell within that spectrum. Public attention remained intense throughout the trial. The case had already become a focal point for broader discussions in South Korea, and the courtroom proceedings were followed closely by media and citizens alike. For many, the trial was not only about the outcome for the accused, but also about how the justice system would address the underlying issues highlighted by the case. Outside the courtroom, the memorial near Gangnam Station continued to draw visitors. What had begun as a spontaneous expression of grief had evolved into a lasting symbol. The notes left by thousands of people reflected a wide range of emotions: sorrow, anger, fear, and a desire for change. The site became a physical reminder that the impact of the crime extended far beyond the individuals directly involved. As the trial progressed, both sides presented their arguments in full. The prosecution reiterated that the evidence supported a finding of intent and responsibility. The defense maintained that the suspect's mental state required a different interpretation. The court listened to testimony, reviewed evidence, and considered expert opinions, all while aware of the broader significance of the case. For the family of the victim, The proceedings were a continuation of an unimaginable loss. While the legal process focused on evidence and argument, for them it remained deeply personal. The outcome of the trial would not undo what had happened, but it would determine how the act was recognized and addressed within the framework of justice. As the hearings came to an end, the case reached a critical point. The evidence had been presented, the arguments made, and the legal questions defined. What remained was the court's decision, a decision that would not only determine the fate of Kim, but also shape how the case would be remembered in the years to come. And at the center of that decision lay a fundamental question. How should the law respond when an act is both deliberate in execution and complex in explanation? As the trial reached its conclusion in the Gangnam Station murder case, the court in Seoul was faced with the responsibility of delivering a judgment that would address not only the facts of the crime, but also the complex questions raised throughout the proceedings. The actions of Kim were not in dispute. What remained was how those actions would be interpreted under the law, whether they reflected full criminal responsibility, or whether his mental condition significantly altered that assessment. After reviewing the evidence, including surveillance timelines, forensic findings, and extensive psychiatric evaluations, the court determined that while the defendant did suffer from mental illness, he still possessed sufficient awareness and control over his actions at the time of the crime. The prolonged waiting period inside the restroom near Gangnam Station, the selective nature of the attack, and his ability to carry out the act without immediate detection were all cited as indicators that he understood what he was doing. However, the court also acknowledged that his mental condition could not be ignored. It was recognized as a contributing factor, though not one that eliminated responsibility. As a result, the sentence reflected a balance between these two findings. Kim was convicted and sentenced to a lengthy prison term rather than the maximum possible penalty, with the court taking into account both the severity of the crime and the influence of his psychological state. The verdict brought a measure of legal closure, but it did not end the broader impact of the case. Across South Korea, the incident had already sparked a national conversation that extended far beyond the courtroom. The memorial near Gangnam Station, filled with thousands of notes and messages, had become a symbol of collective grief and reflection. Even after the trial concluded, the memory of that space remained powerful, representing both the loss of a life and the questions that followed. The case influenced discussions about public safety, particularly in spaces that are widely assumed to be secure. It prompted renewed attention to how such environments are monitored and how individuals can be protected in everyday situations. At the same time, it brought mental health into sharper focus, highlighting the challenges of identifying and addressing severe conditions before they result in harm. Another lasting aspect of the case was the way it shaped public awareness. For many, the events of May 17, 2016 served as a moment of realization that violence can occur in places and at times that seem ordinary, and that understanding its causes requires looking beyond simple explanations. The differing interpretations of motive, whether rooted in personal grievance, mental illness, or broader societal factors, remain part of the ongoing conversation. For the victim's family, the conclusion of the trial marked the end of one phase, but not the end of their loss. Legal outcomes can provide answers within a structured system, but they do not erase the emotional impact of what has been taken. Their focus, like that of many families in similar situations, remained on remembering the individual behind the case, a life that had been lived, not just a tragedy that had occurred. Over time, the Gangnam Station murder case became more than a single incident. It became part of a larger narrative about how societies respond to violence, how they balance accountability with understanding, and how they strive to prevent similar events in the future. It also served as a reminder that even in highly developed urban centers like Seoul, no place is entirely immune to unexpected acts of harm. Today, the case is remembered not only for what happened, but for the conversations it started. It stands as an example of how a single event can resonate far beyond its immediate context, influencing perspectives, policies, and public awareness. And at its core, it remains a story about a life lost in a moment that should have been ordinary. A reminder that behind every case, every investigation, and every verdict, there is a human story that deserves to be remembered, not just for how it ended, but for what it represents. And even when the legal process reaches its conclusion, the questions it raises can continue long after the verdict is delivered. Story 5. In the spring of 2016, a case emerged from China that would not only reveal a personal tragedy, but also expose deeper systemic issues involving healthcare, technology, and trust. It began not with violence in the traditional sense, but with hope, the kind of hope that drives families to search relentlessly for a cure when faced with a life-threatening illness. That hope, however, would eventually lead to devastating consequences, transforming one young man's story into a national reckoning. Wei Zexi was a 21-year-old college student studying at Zhejiang University. Like many young people, he had plans for the future, ambitions tied to education, and a life that was still unfolding. But he was also battling a rare and aggressive form of cancer, a diagnosis that brought with it not only physical challenges, but also emotional and financial strain for his family. Determined to find treatment options, Wei and his family began searching for solutions beyond conventional methods. Their search led them to information found online, particularly through the widely used search engine operated by Baidu. Among the results was a treatment offered by the second hospital of the Beijing Armed Police Corps, which was promoted as an advanced and effective therapy. The information presented suggested promising outcomes, creating a sense of possibility for a condition that otherwise offered limited options. Trusting the information they found, Wei and his family decided to pursue this treatment. It was a decision rooted in urgency and hope, the belief that this could be the path to recovery. The treatment involved immunotherapy techniques that were described as cutting-edge, though their effectiveness and approval status were not fully transparent. For families facing serious illness, such distinctions can be difficult to evaluate, especially when presented with authoritative language and institutional backing. Wei underwent multiple rounds of treatment, each one accompanied by significant financial cost. The family invested heavily, both economically and emotionally, believing that they were pursuing a legitimate and potentially life-saving option. However, over time, it became clear that the treatment was not producing the expected results. Instead of improvement, Wei's condition continued to deteriorate. As his health declined, Wei began to question the validity of the treatment he had received. In April 2016, he posted a detailed account of his experience on an online forum, describing how he had found the treatment through search results, how it had been presented to him, and how it had ultimately failed to help him. His account was not written in anger alone, but in a tone that reflected disappointment, frustration, and a desire to warn others. Shortly after making this post, Wei Zexi passed away. His death marked the end of his personal struggle, but the beginning of something much larger. His story quickly spread across social media platforms in China, drawing widespread attention and sparking intense public reaction. What had been a private battle became a public issue, raising questions about the role of online platforms, the regulation of medical advertising, and the responsibilities of institutions involved. The focus of the public response extended beyond the hospital itself. Attention turned toward Baidu and its advertising practices. Specifically, the way in which search results were ranked and displayed came under scrutiny. Paid advertisements, which could appear prominently in search results, were not always clearly distinguishable from organic listings. This created a situation where users might assume that the information presented was based on relevance or credibility, rather than payment. For Wei and his family, this distinction had not been clear. The treatment they chose had been influenced by the visibility and presentation of the information they encountered. In the aftermath of his death, many began to question whether the system had failed to provide adequate transparency, and whether stronger safeguards should have been in place to protect users from misleading or unverified claims. As the story gained momentum, it became clear that this was not just about one individual case. It was about the intersection of technology and healthcare, and the ways in which information is presented and interpreted. In an era where online searches are often the first step in decision-making, the accuracy and clarity of that information carry significant weight. Government agencies in China began to respond, initiating investigations into the practices of both the hospital and the search platform. The goal was to determine whether regulations had been violated and what changes might be necessary to prevent similar incidents in the future. These investigations would examine not only the specific details of Wei's case, but also the broader systems that allowed such a situation to occur. At the heart of it all was a simple but profound question. How had a young man searching for hope been led down a path that ultimately failed him? As the story of the murder of Wei Zexi spread rapidly across China, what began as a personal tragedy quickly transformed into a national investigation. The death of Wei Zexi was no longer viewed in isolation. Instead, it became a focal point for examining the systems that had influenced his decisions, particularly the intersection between online information, medical institutions, and regulatory oversight. Public reaction was immediate and intense. Social media platforms were flooded with discussions, many of which centered on the role of Baidu in presenting medical information through its search engine. Users began questioning how paid advertisements were integrated into search results, and whether there was sufficient transparency to distinguish them from organic listings. For many, Wei's experience highlighted a gap between what users believed they were seeing and what was actually being presented. In response to the growing pressure, Chinese regulatory authorities launched formal investigations. Multiple agencies became involved, focusing on both the advertising practices of Baidu and the medical claims made by the hospital that had provided the treatment. The aim was to determine whether any laws or regulations had been violated and whether the information presented to patients had been misleading or incomplete. Investigators examined how the treatment had been marketed. The therapy promoted by the second hospital of the Beijing Armed Police Corps had been described in ways that suggested effectiveness and advanced scientific backing. However, as the investigation progressed, questions emerged about the actual clinical validity of the treatment. Authorities looked into whether the therapy had been properly approved, whether its success rates had been accurately represented, and whether patients had been given sufficient information to make informed decisions. At the same time, scrutiny fell heavily on the ranking system used by Baidu. It became clear that paid placements could significantly influence which results appeared most prominently. For users searching for critical information, especially regarding medical treatment, this created a situation where visibility did not necessarily correlate with reliability. The distinction between advertisement and recommendation was not always clear, and this lack of clarity became a central issue in the investigation. As more details emerged, it became evident that Wei's case was not entirely unique. Other patients had also sought treatment based on similar information, raising concerns about how widespread the issue might be. The investigation began to take on a broader scope, examining not just a single incident but a pattern of practices that could affect many individuals. The hospital involved faced its own level of scrutiny. Authorities reviewed its affiliations, its licensing, and the way it presented its services to the public. Questions were raised about the relationship between public institutions and private contractors operating within them, as well as the oversight mechanisms in place to ensure compliance with medical standards. The findings suggested that the system was more complex than it appeared, with multiple layers of responsibility that were not always clearly defined. For the family of Wei Zexi, the investigation was both a search for answers and a pursuit of accountability. Their focus was not only on understanding what had happened to Wei, but also on ensuring that similar situations could be prevented in the future. They spoke about the trust they had placed in the information they found and the belief that they were making the best possible decision under difficult circumstances. The broader public discourse continued to evolve. Discussions about the case expanded to include topics such as consumer protection, medical ethics, and the responsibilities of technology platforms. Many people began to reconsider how they approached online information, particularly in areas as critical as health. The case served as a reminder that access to information, while valuable, also requires careful evaluation and clear regulation. As the investigation progressed, regulatory authorities began to outline potential reforms. These included stricter guidelines for medical advertising, clearer labeling of paid search results, and enhanced oversight of healthcare providers. The goal was to address the gaps that had been exposed and to create a system that offered greater transparency and accountability. Yet even as these efforts moved forward, the central issue remained deeply personal. At the heart of the case was a young man who had sought treatment in good faith, relying on the information available to him. The systems that were now under investigation had shaped his decisions, but they had not protected him from harm. And as the findings continued to emerge, the question that lingered was not just about what had gone wrong, but about how many others might have faced similar choices without realizing the risks. As the investigation into the murder of Wei Zexi progressed, authorities in China began to move from inquiry toward conclusion, compiling findings that would not only address the circumstances surrounding the death of Wei Zexi, but also define accountability across multiple institutions. What had initially appeared to be a tragic medical outcome was now being examined as a systemic failure, one involving the presentation of information, the regulation of medical services, and the responsibilities of platforms that connected users to those services. Regulatory agencies conducted detailed reviews of the second hospital of the Beijing Armed Police Corps and the treatment it had promoted. Investigators analyzed medical records, promotional materials, and internal procedures to determine whether the therapy offered to Wei had been represented accurately. Their findings raised serious concerns. The treatment, while described as advanced and effective, lacked sufficient clinical validation to support the claims made in its promotion. This discrepancy between representation and reality became a central issue in determining responsibility. At the same time, scrutiny intensified on the role of Baidu. Authorities examined how search results were ranked and how advertisements were integrated into the platform. It was found that paid content could significantly influence visibility, allowing certain medical providers to appear prominently regardless of the strength of their clinical evidence. While such practices were not entirely outside existing regulations at the time, the investigation highlighted the potential for misuse when clear distinctions between advertising and informational content were not maintained. As these findings were compiled, regulators began to take action. The hospital involved faced administrative penalties, and its ability to promote certain treatments was restricted. The investigation also led to broader reforms in how medical institutions were allowed to advertise their services. Stricter requirements were introduced to ensure that claims made in promotional materials were supported by verified evidence, and oversight mechanisms were strengthened to monitor compliance. Baidu was also required to implement changes. These included clearer labeling of paid search results, adjustments to how medical advertisements were ranked, and limits on the proportion of sponsored content that could appear on a results page. The company publicly acknowledged the concerns raised by the case and stated its intention to improve transparency and user protection. While these measures addressed some of the immediate issues, they also reflected a broader shift in expectations regarding the responsibilities of technology platforms. The case prompted a wider review of online medical information across China. Authorities began examining other platforms and providers to identify similar practices, aiming to prevent future incidents. This expansion of the investigation underscored the extent to which the issues highlighted by Wei's case were not isolated, but part of a larger system that required reform. For the family of Wei Zexi, the official findings provided a measure of clarity, but they could not undo what had happened. The recognition that the treatment had been misrepresented and that the system had allowed it to be promoted so prominently confirmed their concerns. At the same time, it reinforced the importance of the changes being implemented as a way to ensure that others would not face the same situation. Public response to the findings was significant. Many saw the case as a turning point, a moment when long-standing issues were brought into focus and addressed at a national level. Discussions about trust in online information, particularly in the context of healthcare, became more prominent. People began to question not only what information they were receiving, but also how it was being presented and prioritized. The case also influenced perceptions of accountability. It demonstrated that responsibility in such situations is often shared across multiple entities: those who provide services, those who promote them, and those who regulate the systems in which they operate. Addressing one aspect without considering the others would not be sufficient to prevent similar outcomes. As the immediate actions concluded, the impact of the case continued to unfold. The reforms introduced in response to the investigation began to take effect, altering how medical information was presented and accessed. While these changes could not affect the past, they represented an effort to shape the future in a way that prioritized accuracy, transparency, and user protection. Yet even as these developments progressed, the central reality remained unchanged. A young man had placed his trust in a system that failed to provide the clarity and reliability he needed. The consequences of that failure extended beyond his individual case, influencing policies, practices, and public awareness across the country. And as the system began to adjust, one question continued to resonate. How could trust be rebuilt in a space where information had once led to harm? As the aftermath of the murder of Wei Zexi settled across China, the case left behind something deeper than regulatory change. It reshaped how an entire society thought about trust in the digital age. What began as the personal struggle of Wei Zexi had evolved into a defining moment that forced institutions, companies, and individuals to reconsider how life-altering decisions are influenced by information found online. In the years that followed, the reforms initiated during the investigation began to take hold. Medical advertising regulations were tightened, requiring clearer verification of claims and stronger oversight of how treatments were presented to the public. Hospitals and healthcare providers faced increased scrutiny, particularly those offering experimental or less established therapies. The goal was not only to prevent misinformation, but to ensure that patients and families could make decisions based on accurate, transparent data rather than persuasive language. Baidu, as one of the central entities involved in the case, implemented changes to its platform. Sponsored content became more clearly labeled, and the structure of search results was adjusted to reduce the potential for confusion between paid placements and organic information. These changes were part of a broader effort to restore user confidence, acknowledging that the way information is presented can be just as important as the information itself. But beyond policy and platform adjustments, the impact of the case was felt on a more human level. For many people in China, Wei's story became a cautionary example, a reminder that access to information does not guarantee its reliability. Families facing medical crises often operate under intense pressure, making decisions quickly and with limited ability to evaluate complex scientific claims. The case highlighted the vulnerability of those situations and the responsibility of systems designed to support them. The public discourse that followed did not fade quickly. Discussions about medical ethics, consumer protection, and digital responsibility continued, shaping how similar issues were approached in the years that followed. The case became part of a larger narrative about the role of technology in everyday life, how it can empower users, but also how it can mislead if not properly regulated. For the family of Wei Zexi, the changes that emerged from the case represented a form of legacy. While no reform could replace what had been lost, the knowledge that his story had contributed to meaningful change offered a measure of purpose. Their experience became a voice within a broader movement toward greater accountability and transparency. The case also influenced how institutions approached responsibility. It demonstrated that in complex systems, outcomes are rarely the result of a single failure. Instead, they emerge from a combination of factors, decisions, practices, and structures that interact in ways that are not always immediately visible. Addressing such outcomes requires a comprehensive approach, one that considers each layer of the system and how they connect. Today, the story of Wei Zexi is remembered not only for its tragic outcome, but for the questions it raised and the changes it inspired. It stands as a reminder that trust, once broken, must be rebuilt through consistent effort and clear accountability. It also underscores the importance of critical evaluation in an environment where information is abundant but not always reliable. At its core, the case is about more than a single event. It is about the relationship between people and the systems they rely on, systems that shape decisions, influence actions, and, in some cases, determine outcomes. It is about the need for those systems to function with integrity, particularly when the stakes are as high as human life. And in the end, the story of Wei Zexi remains a powerful reminder of what can happen when trust is placed in something that fails to deliver on its promise. A reminder that behind every search, every decision, and every system, there are real lives affected by the outcomes, and that ensuring those outcomes are guided by truth and responsibility is not just a technical challenge, but a human one. Thank you for joining me here at Mr. Midnight. True crime stories remind us of life's mysteries and the importance of staying aware even as we seek comfort in the quiet of the night. Let the rain carry you to a peaceful sleep. And until we meet again, stay safe, stay curious,